Hello, Stephen. How are you doing?
I'm good. How you doing, Josh?
Not too bad, not too bad. So let me just get us going. I am Josh Summers. This is Meaning of Life TV, and you are Stephen Asma, or I should say Professor Stephen Asma,
Exactly.
Professor of Philosophy at Columbia College in Chicago. You're, and I saw on one bio you're a distinguished scholar.
Yes, I'm a
So
distinguished scholar.
yeah, you're a distinguished
I've been
scholar.
told I've been told by other distinguished scholars that I'm too young to be a distinguished scholar. But yes, I have been named a distinguished scholar at my institution.
Fantastic. You are also founding fellow of the research group in mind, science, and culture at Chicago College or Columbia College.
Right.
And as some of us can see, I don't know if it's in the window that will be recorded, but you have an upright bass behind you, which reminds us that you're an accomplished blues and jazz musician, as well as a graphic artist. So, is there anything I left off there?
No, I think that's pretty thorough. Thank you. Embarrassing, but I appreciate it. Yes.
Oh, nothing to be embarrassed about. It's actually pretty amazing. The reason we're speaking is you've written a new book called Why We Need Religion. I can show the Kindle cover that I have.
Oh, it comes out pretty nice on the Kindle. That's the first I've seen it
Yeah, well,
on
this is
Kindle.
an iPad, so it is in color, where the Kindle, the actual Kindle I have, would be a black and white representation. But why we need religion, which is a big topic. To start out the interview, I want to ask you kind of a general couple questions. One, how did you, a professor of philosophy and noted skeptic agnostic, come to write this book? And connected to that, who was your intended audience that you had in mind as you went through your argument?
I guess. Yeah, I'm kind of on record. I would say the first 10, 15, maybe for the past 20 years, I've been writing works that are largely skeptical, philosophical books. This is my ninth book, and my 10th book comes out next year. And so I'm on record as being fairly hostile to religion. I wrote regularly for the Skeptic magazine, and I'm one of the people who early on sort of argued for a very secular form of Buddhism when I wrote a book in the 90s called Buddha for Beginners. So it might surprise some people, if anybody has followed my career to date, that I would now be praising religion. And I have to very quickly point out that I am not the typical guy who gets old and then has this nostalgia for the religion that he grew up on and wants to lecture people about how great faith is. That's not the argument I'm making. I do think that religion has gotten kind of in intellectual circles, it's not gotten a fair deal in terms of articulation. And so, but I'm definitely arguing for a kind of Darwinian defense of religion in this book. My own work has sort of divided between philosophy of biology, and I've done a number of things on evolution and philosophy, and also Buddhism and philosophy of religion. And what I began to see maybe about 5 or 6, no, this has got to go back 10 years actually. I started traveling a lot in Asia about 15 years ago. And there I discovered, I'd been raised a Catholic and was a believer until I hit college. And then I studied philosophy and I thought, oh, Catholicism is really kind of indefensible. And I thought it was not so much wrong or stupid, but provincial. I thought, well, this is just one religion out of all these other religions. How can this be right? And I began to learn more about Buddhism and Hinduism. But then about 15 years ago, I started traveling a lot in Asia. So I lived in Cambodia. I traveled in Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. And then since then, I've lived in China, in Shanghai, and then another time I lived in Beijing. And I began to see sort of religion from this different perspective when I was living, particularly in the developing world, like Cambodia. I saw that it was incredibly helpful to people who were struggling and suffering, and that both the psychological ideas that you find in Buddhism about, training the mind, but also the magical thinking too, and the rituals and the social life of Buddhism. And so then when I came back to the States, I began to see, oh, it's doing that here too. I just couldn't see it before. It's the main function of Western religions too, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. And around this time, about 10 years ago, I started studying emotional neuroscience. So I studied with Jaak Panksepp, who's considered like the father of emotional neuroscience or affective neuroscience. And I learned about these sort of 7 emotional systems that we share with all mammals. And slowly I began to see that there was a way in which religion is really good at managing our emotional life. A lot of people get hung up, it's the beliefs, either you believe that Jesus is the Son of God or you don't, or you believe that Muhammad is the prophet. But I began to see that actually what religion is doing is helping us with these emotions. And so that's what drove the writing of the book.
Right. It seems to be your central thesis, that religion is a kind of codified system for emotional management.
Right. It's probably one of our oldest and one of our best cultural sort of systems for emotional therapy.
Mm-hmm. So definitely want to unpack that a little bit more. But in writing this, so the second part of my first question was, like, who did you intend to have in your audience here? Because obviously everyone's familiar with the brand of what's being referred to as the new atheists, with Dawkins and Hitchens or the late Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dennett, and they're all very inimical to any idea of religiosity, that it's kind of the backwater of human culture, and
right.
that it's a repository for every bad idea that humans have produced. And if we could just transcend and grow out of that dark age, there would be a secular flourishing. And you're like, within your book, there's kind of a very kind of sophisticated but gentle pushback to that, right, to sort of that thesis. So are you writing to one of them, or people that have been, because in all transparency, I feel like I was very much swayed by them maybe 15 years ago. I can't remember when The God Delusion came out, but
yeah, that sounds right.
I was never raised religious, but I kind of globbed on to yoga practice and Buddhism as a kind of self-stylized form of religion. Like, this is something I can resonate with. And I probably even bought into the idea that I'm spiritual but not religious, that whole cliche. And then when I read The God Delusion and some of the other ones, I sort of, it was like looking at myself in the mirror more closely, and I was like, I can't be so close to these kinds of superstitious, metaphysical, mumbo jumbo, woo woo ideas, and I felt like in some ways there was kind of an emotional appeal to their arguments. Like, I was kind of swayed by the strength of the emotion that they had around how religion was holding us back. So anyway,
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that group, let's say the new atheists, they portray, and their fans, and I liked a lot of their work, don't get me wrong here, but they fashion themselves and portray themselves as fairly unemotional. Just reason, the cold light of reason tells us the truth, and we step in line with it because we are adults, and that's their view. However, anybody who looks at the rhetoric of the books and the ideas will find, as William James noticed, back 100 years ago, that this kind of atheism is also very emotional. The people who are this way are desperate. Sort of two emotions or two psychological positions arise. It's sort of at the background of the formal arguments for atheism. The psychology is that if I'm one of these atheists, the last thing I want is to be duped. Like, there's just a general sense that whatever happens, I don't want to go down thinking I believed in something that was false. Mm-hmm. And so you don't want to be a boob or a rube, and you will and so your skepticism is kind of like this constant,
highly vigilant.
Yeah, highly vigilant.
Yeah.
And William James thought, like, this is a kind of an emotional style itself. Like, I am just always going to be on edge and watching so that I don't end up believing something for which there is not good evidence. But then the second sort of emotional or psychological ingredient in a lot of this stuff is outrage. I mean, if you read Dawkins or Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens, you saw little masterpieces of outrage. Like, how can these people be so stupid as to believe this and this and this? And aren't you with me against these idiots? Mm-hmm. And what you get is a kind of, talk about tribalism. You get a tribe that's kind of circle jerking each other about how rational they are and how stupid everybody else is. And that's fine, especially developmentally, when you're trying to get over the kind of, maybe the head game that religion gave you when you were younger. And so I'm not, saying there's no place for this kind of skepticism and hostility, but right away it seems to me there's some problems. And so I am trying to address those guys and their followers. I'm trying to address the believers because they're also very religious, and then I'm also trying to describe really this gigantic middle territory of where most people are. Because like everything else in the media, the extremes get the attention. Mm-hmm. The hardcore believers and the hardcore atheists are the ones that dominate the conversation. But most of us are living in this middle territory. Now, with regard to people like the new atheists, one of the things that I'm arguing in this book is, and this is a sort of the Darwinian angle, is that we now accept in psychology and in philosophy that the mind is really a very sophisticated prediction processor. It basically evolved to try to figure out what's going to happen next. And using our perceptions of the external world, we're trying to predict, okay, what do I need to know in order to survive in this world? What's going to happen next in terms of the weather, in terms of the physical environment? And so our mind, our cognitive system, is basically this prediction processor. We're trying to get our predictions more and more accurate to what might happen. And we all recognize this, and this is sort of now the dominant view of how the mind evolved. But the argument I'm making is that is not just a rational process. The first prediction processor is the limbic system, emotional systems. And this is something we share with other mammals. We come into the world loaded with, psychologists sort of disagree about the number, but it's probably between 4 and 7 basic emotions. Things like fear, rage, lust. And then we are basically operating in a social environment with other, primates, trying to figure out, okay, what is this guy going to do next? What should I do in order to get a sexual, conquest? What do I need to do with this alpha male? That whole social environment is a kind of prediction processing that our emotional mind is doing. Now, this is something that even the most scientifically minded atheist needs to acknowledge. And that means that part of our operating system is not interested in whether or not the claim is true or false, but whether the behavior is advantageous. Does it actually lead to more fitness? Is it adaptive? Does it help me get, more success in my social world? And that's all part of the emotional life. So this is sort of the message, the Darwinian defense that I'm trying to bring.
Mm-hmm. I think you used a pair of, or differentiated between indicative truth, right, and you didn't maybe use that word truth with it, but indicative knowledge and imperative knowledge. Yes,
imperative and indicative, correct. Yeah.
Because I think that's where the secularists come in. They kind of just want to get the indicative. What is actually here? What's the reality? If we can line up with that, then our behavior will fall in accordance in a certain way. But you're saying that most people seem to be occupying more of an imperative, what do I need to do mode. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And we know, there's a wonderful philosopher of biology and language named Ruth Millikan, and some of the, I think, viewers or listeners will recognize her name. And she sort of makes this point, like, most animals in the world operate in this imperative mode. They are not out to, your dog, your cat, is not out to describe the world as accurately as possible. That is not its interest. It is simply needs a thumbnail sketch of how the world works, and then it needs to know, oh, should I approach this thing or should I run away from it? Should I eat this thing or should I not eat this thing? Should I have sex with this thing or not? That's the imperative world. And these two things are very close together, like the way we describe the world and our action towards the world are really so close together that we confuse them. So if I say, the dog is coming, I could just be describing a state of affairs. That's indicative. But if I say the dog is coming, that's now an imperative use of language. And what I'm arguing in the book is that there's really two epistemologies. There's an indicative epistemology and an imperative epistemology, which means there's two ways of sort of operating in the world or seeing the world. The new atheists and the science ideologues see the world entirely, like you said, in the indicative mode. How best can we describe it? Does our model fit nature? And we can use the scientific method to see whether or not our predictions are successful. But most human beings are living in the imperative world, which is sort of like it's the world of stories. Mm-hmm. It's the world of drama. The world we live in is like filled with good guys and bad guys. You just pick today, like how many times today or on a given day when you're going to work, are you like, yeah, I got to get the exact scientific description of this thing right? No, in fact, you're riding the bus and you're dealing with people and you're solving a variety of social problems that are not particularly scientific. You need to have good predictions about what behaviors are going to be, but those predictions are based more on associations. Like, I've seen this angry face before, and then comes like a punch. And that's an association. And those of us living in the imperative world, including scientists and the new atheists, are forgetting that they're living in this world. And they're focusing instead on this other epistemology, which is very good and very important for describing and understanding nature. But I think the emotions and art and music and these things are actually better for understanding the social world. Mm-hmm. So religion is part of this ability to develop and have social intelligence, because it's largely managing and understanding your own emotions and the emotions of the other people in your life.
So yes, let's move into like connecting religion into that. We're bringing religion into this part of the conversation. What specifically in our emotional life is the religious container going to help someone navigate, in your view, better than someone who doesn't have that container or doesn't have that acculturation?
Yeah, I mean, I should add like a quick caveat, which is, the name of the book is Why We Need Religion. And some people reasonably can read that as saying like everybody has to have it. And that's not exactly what I meant by that title. But, marketing is what it is. It's not that you, Josh, and I, Steve, have to have religion or we're somehow diminished people. I don't think that's true. But we have the advantage of other pseudo-religious forms of emotional management. We were talking before, yoga, and the world of yoga is, I would argue, is very much like a religious therapeutic system. I was just suggesting that art and music, certainly psychology, and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and psychiatry, these are very valuable forms of emotional management, and maybe they even do better than religion. But my point in the book is, one, how old is psychology? Come on. It's 100 years old. The whole rest of human history, that work has been done by religion. So that's part of my argument. And secondly, how many people in the world, the developing world, and even, places where there's a lot of wealth like China, how many of them do you think have access or even interest in pursuing psychological methods of therapy? Very few. That is a tiny little percentage of, fairly, relatively wealthy Westerners living in very specific urban centers that have access to psychological therapies. And if that's how you get your management, good on you. That's great. But I can tell you that there's no such thing in the developing world, and there's no access to it. And in places like China, there's no cultural appreciation of therapy. Now, maybe they'll get there, and that's going to be a good thing. But my point is that religion has been doing all this cultural work really for thousands of years. Like, our earliest culture is religion. And also it continues to do this good work all around the world. So that's just a caveat to your question. Now let's get to your point, which is what are the things that it's helping us do? One is it's some obvious things that everybody recognizes. It reduces stress and depression. It helps us handle grief and loss. It's very good at sort of focusing or relieving anxiety. That we see prayer and meditation, prayer in the West and meditation in the East is a phenomenal, and yoga is a phenomenal way of handling anxiety or tamping it down or channeling it. But it's not, it helps you handle things like lust too. If human beings acted on all their lustful urges, we'd be living like, well, I was going to say dogs, but really dogs are not so bad on this because
we'd be living like bonobos, right?
Yeah, okay, good. We'd be living like bonobos. And hey, what's wrong with that? No, but you can't get the cultural, cooperative, social world off the ground if we're pursuing, all of our lustful urges. And so religion comes along and helps us manage lust in a way that we can deal with. But it also, so those are some the really good things that religion does for people.
The latter one, though, starts to sound a little bit like social control and oppression of some sort, and that's where people's hackles get up a little bit, right?
No doubt that's true, and I'm sure religion has done some fairly. I mean, even Freud recognized this. He said religion took the diversity and the sort of complexity of sexual orientation and sexual attraction, and then just squeezed it down to just these two, basically just heterosexual sex within the confines of marriage. And this causes tremendous suffering to a lot of people. I mean, it's no mystery or news to people what kind of negative influence religion has had in how we perceive homosexuality. And my job is I'm not interested in defending religion from this stuff. I think that's bad. And we need to reform religion so that it is never dehumanizing people who are different, but always humanizing. On the other hand, it is true that religion has had to sort of domesticate emotions like lust and aggression, in part because at least traditional society has been nuclear families inside increasingly larger social groups. And if I pursue my own sexual goals with abandon, then I am actually going to upset the social balance. I'm going to make it very difficult now for myself because there's going to be terrible revenge on me. I mean, look at old world morality. This is why I think people sort of have a love-hate relationship with mobster movies. Is in our world of laws and egalitarian justice, somebody rapes your daughter, you go to the state, and the state builds a case against the enemy and the person who did this, and then basically you have a trial and they go to jail. In The Godfather, you just get the biggest alpha male to go and kill this guy. Now that's kind of old world justice. I'm not defending that. I'm just simply saying, like, it was good for human beings to learn how to keep it in their pants, now and again, because it led to greater and greater social cooperation and cohesion. So yeah, I do think religion is part of what I would call the domestication of emotions. And that's true of aggression too, because if you look around the animal kingdom, most men are terrible fathers. Like, they're just horrible fathers. Like, they kill their own cubs regularly. They kill the cubs of others. They put the females back into estrus and have sex with them to continue their gene line. I mean, it's ugly. So here comes religion, and it helps males basically domesticate even things like anger and aggression, turn the other cheek. I mean, you see in all major religions, it's comprised of advice and stories and iconography, even about how to handle aggression, and largely for the good, so that you don't act out and do this kind of stuff.
Trying to think where to bounce off from that. You sort of got into it a little bit, but like the new atheists would say, we don't need the religion or the metaphysics, the Dark Age stories to manage our emotional life. And I can agree with you that maybe like psychology is relatively young, and as you said, throughout the majority of the world, there's not going to be a lot of sympathy or interest in like a psychotherapeutic process per se. But it seems to me that when you're referring to religion, you're referring to like the rituals within it and the stories within it, that kind of the parables and the stories that convey meaning and lessons and kind of guidelines for action. Those are the things that seem to be bringing the medicine, if you will, that you're referring to.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if, like, is there a way that like those elements could be brought together in a way that didn't necessarily require sort of either the metaphysics or the weird magic and that kind of thing, or is that? Do you think that's part and parcel of like when you moderate religion? Is there a way to get it more on board with a secular modern world, or is the magical, bizarre metaphysical stuff required as part of its therapeutic role?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think since I'm not praising religion as a way to understand nature. Of course, science replaces it. I'm not even praising religion as a way of getting morality. That argument has been made by many, and that's not the argument I'm giving. I am saying it has these therapeutic benefits for the individual and for the group. Now you're saying, well, that comes with a lot of metaphysical baggage. Like, Christians believe that God is in his heaven and that Jesus is his son. And Muslims believe that Allah is God and Muhammad was his messenger. Can you have the good therapeutic aspects without the metaphysics? My argument is yes, because what you're benefiting from in religion is the social interaction that you're having with the community that you're in. This is why I think religion is actually superior to being spiritual. And so I was making this case a couple of weeks ago in the Los Angeles Times, where I was contrasting like the person who's religious versus one who sees themselves as spiritual. And as we know, the larger and larger group of nuns, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, people who don't have a religious affiliation, will see themselves as spiritual. I mean, some people say they're agnostic and even atheist, but the largest group of nuns is actually still very supernatural and has a lot of magical beliefs. It's just not their parents' church or their parents' temple. And so,
actually, it might be good just to like spell out what are some of those beliefs that you see that they have.
Well, yeah, a lot of them are understandably upset about organized religion because of,
sexual abuse.
Sexual abuse, jihad, extremism, all that stuff is connected to traditional religion. The hypocrisy of religion is it can barely stand it. So they'll jettison the traditional religion. This is basically the millennials, and coming up, I guess the Gen Z folks too, as they get older, seem to be in this same group. So they'll jettison the traditional monotheism, but they're they like spooky stuff. I mean, they use a lot of accoutrements like crystals and totems and talisman and objects that you might associate with paganism. Mm-hmm. Many of my students, because I teach in an art school, many of my students profess quite openly that they're Wiccan, that they're witches. And of course, what they mean by that is a kind of form of pre-Christian pagan ideas that sort of nature worship, a kind of animism about nature, and that with the right magical implements, you can influence nature and your own path in life so that you're happier. And so many of the students, and I think the people in the nuns group, are very drawn to Wiccans, witches. Yoga is really big, but a kind of metaphysical view of yoga, like, that not just that it's an exercise and it's helpful, but there's a kind of whole metaphysical system. We've talked about this before. The chakra system is a metaphysical system. It might turn out to be a kind of, and the qi system in Chinese medicine is like this too. It might turn out to be reducible down to physiology or pure science, but it hasn't been reduced yet. They also, I'm trying to think of some of the other stuff they're into.
Yeah, well, you're thinking, one of the things that I hear all the time, and people seem to have no intellectual qualms with it, right? Like they reject God, but right. Yet the universe is dialed in to them specifically and uniquely, yes. giving them clues and lessons and secrets and trials along the way. The universe, and I hesitate to say that because I don't want to offend anyone or be impolite or anything, but I often encourage people to just reflect for a moment, like how big the universe actually is, and then to think of us as this infinitesimally tiny fleck of dust within that, and that there's something within that is giving.
No, it seems a little narcissistic to think the whole universe is looking out for you, and but it shows you that the idea that you see in people like Steven Pinker and others who are sort of saying there's a new enlightenment, and they're sort of claiming the nuns as part of this trajectory of rationality out of the swamp of supernaturalism. I just want to say, no, that is not happening. Mm-hmm. What's happening is the nature of the metaphysical beliefs are changing, but many of the young people are just as supernatural and superstitious as the old timers.
Well, actually, I'd even challenge that for a second. Is it the nature of the metaphysical beliefs changing, or is it just the terminology and labels ascribed to the metaphysical beliefs?
Yeah, maybe that's even it, which shows you. It's an interesting issue, because when you talked about the idea that the universe is still sort of looking out for you. This really is just monotheism. Unless you want to get sophisticated and say, well, what we're really talking about is a pantheism, where God is in all things, and like Spinoza, but that's not what my students are thinking. It's not worked out in that way. They just think that the universe is looking out for them, and that it's by and large a benevolent place, and you just got to get the right rituals and frames of mind, positive thinking, and it's all going to align. All the fates are going to align. So in a way, that does sound like just old-fashioned metaphysics, with new terminology. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and that with what you're saying now raises a few questions around. You sort of finished the book saying, basically, which I've heard from other people, like religion is here, more or less to stay.
Yeah,
like it's the idea that kind of the secular hope that it's just going to be swept away. Is just that, a hope in some sense.
Yeah.
And I've the connection I'm making here is you talked about Buddhism in the book as being kind of an exception to some of the theistic religions in that it does not acknowledge a creator being. It does not acknowledge a soul that survives death. And yet, from what I've gathered in looking at developments within Buddhism, it seems like that notion of an unchanging, eternal element, whether it's like a conception of emptiness that's underlying everything, underlying all manifest reality, that conception of an eternal element kind of rears its head back up in developments within Buddhism through the centuries, and seems to be in contradiction to kind of the philosophical principles that the Buddha was trying to get at.
Yeah.
And so I've wondered, sort of mused about this, whether this is just an artifact of the human mind, that there is this propensity to, like a default to some kind of metaphysic around eternalism, omniscience, something outside of this that
the unconditioned.
Exactly, and it gets labeled that with capital U in early Buddhism. The unconditioned, the deathless, that kind of thing.
I mean, I would say, like I try to say two ways in which I think religion is here to stay.
Can I just tack on one part of my question that I didn't get out was this relates to the issue of evolution, but theory of mind seems to have been crucial for the development of our species. And I'm wondering if it's that, like, the theory of mind component that predisposes us to have this projection to causal to events that we can't explain, so we ascribe it to some external mind.
That
may have been a curveball in the question, but
well, I think let me start with the last part, and then go backwards. I think that that makes sense in terms of, like, the theory of mind, as psychology has sort of shown, is a sort of system that comes online at a certain age of development. Little kids don't have it, and some people on the autistic spectrum also lack this ability to understand the mind of others, to think that another person has different beliefs or hopes and expectations and different information than I do. And
so is that the definition of it, though, that it's just the ability to project into another's mind and
yes,
sort of imagine what they're thinking?
Right. It's not that they don't, like, it's not that a little kid doesn't think the person has a mind. It's that the assumption of the little kid appears to be that everyone else has the exact same mind they do, that we all share the same information. And it's almost like what happens is the child acquires the ability to discriminate different minds, and that different minds have different information and desires and expectations. And so I would not be surprised if we found that the earliest forms of religion, like animism, are in fact expressions of over-applying this theory of mind. I know a kid eventually figures out, and a pre-literate person figures out, that their mother and their brother has a mind, but eventually they start thinking, well, the river has a mind, the tree has a mind. Mm-hmm. And we're suddenly off and running with animism. And basically this is probably how early religion got going. My own view is that theory of mind has gotten kind of too big for its britches, and that my own view is that the imagination is really the way to talk about this, because human beings early on are imaginative beings. And the idea that we could think of a river as being a personality, or that there's a personality in the sky who sees everything, is an imaginative activity. And to just think of it as theory of mind, I think, is too reductionistic. Mm-hmm. But to your other questions, I think one of the reasons why religion is always going to be with us is because human beings are always going to be vulnerable. There's something about human vulnerability that is you just can't, and if you're very, very lucky, you will get through life without the kind of misery and suffering that the rest of us are going to have to deal with. But if you lose your child dies, or your child is really sick. I mean, this is one of the things I had this sort of understanding when my kid was in the emergency room. And I just thought, okay, I'm not that old, but I've lived a while. I have never felt this vulnerable in all my life. And that's not like, I don't know how to convey that to somebody who's not a parent, because I just don't know how to do it. Like, maybe you've been sick, maybe somebody you care about has been sick, so you know what it's like to be that troubled and freaked out. But when it's your kid, there's just a whole new level of vulnerability that happens. And it doesn't matter how good you get at the sciences. It doesn't matter how good medicine is going to get. If my kid is sick, or I've got cancer, or somebody I love was in a terrible accident, or even if unlike most of our listeners, many people around the world have real enemies. What does that mean? That means somebody in the world wants to kill you. They want you dead. They don't just not like you. I don't like your views. They want to kill you. A lot of people have to deal with that on a daily basis. So my view is that that's the kind of vulnerability that humans will always have, and that's the kind of vulnerability that religion goes straight for. Now, some of that is going to be assuaged and helped through magical thinking, and people are going to be like, oh, well, this is, how can you have false comfort? Because it's your child is going to die, and then you're told by the priest you're going to see your child in heaven. Oh, it's false comfort, Steve.
What was Hitchens' line on that?
I don't remember.
A false consolation is no consolation at all, or no.
I think Hitchens could not be more wrong about that. The idea that there's false consolation is a joke. Are you kidding? Consolation is a feeling. It is a feeling, a positive feeling. Comfort is an affective experience. It's underwritten by oxytocin and internal opioids and endorphins. Truth and falsity doesn't even apply to feelings. Truth and falsity applies to propositions which are trying to see whether they map onto nature properly. Do they correspond? If I say, is it raining outside? That's true or false, because we can then test the proposition and see whether it corresponds with the world. Consolation is, I feel better now. That is an affective feeling. It is neither false nor true. When you wake up sweating after a horrible nightmare and your heart is beating and you're afraid, of course, that never happened. You weren't being chased by a monster. Are you afraid? Hell yes, you're afraid. That's the mistake a lot of these guys keep making by thinking in the indicative mode. So this is the main reason, I think, why religion is always going to be with us. But you raised this other point, which I do think is really interesting too, which is, what about this unconditioned? What about this unitive experience that you see in all the major religions? And here, I do think, I won't go so far as to speculate that this is inevitable, but it sure seems like it crops up a lot in all the religions. Either it's the Godhead that, of the Western world, or it's Brahma from the Upanishads and the Vedas, or it's the sunyata, or the emptiness, the nothing from Buddhism. All of these are sort of, like you said, about some kind of unconditioned that contrasts with all of the dependencies that we see in the world of nature. And here I do think it's interesting because, like, if you look at early Buddhism, you'll see that it's purely negative. What you want to do is, what the Buddha Gautama Siddhartha was doing was he was trying to break the back of a very strong Hindu metaphysics, where Brahma was considered to be perfect and eternal and unchanging, and then the physical world was, this world of becoming and a mess, and eventually we're going to join the eternal world when our Atman rejoins Brahman. So in the early Buddhist works, the Buddha is saying, no, there's no such thing as another eternal realm. It's all impermanent. Everything is a chain of dependencies. Everything is impermanent, and you have no Atman. So early Buddhism was just saying it's nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean it's nothing. It's not something. But you're right. very quickly, Buddhism itself started to interpret the nothing as being not something, because to individuate it is already to be in the world of the conditioned, but for it to be positive. And this is an interesting question about metaphysics. Like, if you see the world as empty, and I'm all the way down empty, what effect does that have on your psychology? Does it make you depressive? Do you think it's interesting?
Well, that word itself, emptiness, like to say the world is empty, and I'm not the philosopher, so if I misuse one of these philosophical terms, just call me out. But empty in the ontological sense that's
right.
Versus empty of something. Like my room is empty of an elephant right now. So there's a kind of emptiness of elephantness in my room, which I've had exposure to some teachers who say that that's what really actually the Buddha was getting at, is that your experience is empty of maybe selfish craving or selfish reactivity. And so an experience unconditioned by reactivity in kind of a very pragmatic of this world sense becomes elevated to the unconditioned with a capital U as some layer or alternative dimension which is perceived in rarefied states of meditation or realization.
Yeah, that's right, and I agree. I think it's confusing because emptiness in the early work is designed to critique the idea of dualism, that there is a perfect world that's unchanging, and there's an imperfect world of development. And the Buddha is trying to say there's just one world. So he's trying to get rid of this idea of an eternal, perfect world that has in Buddhism, the question is, does it have substance? Svabha. And the Buddha says, no, what he's trying to cut off is something like this. You're made up of material things, but the tradition in the Hinduism he was raised on is that at least Atman is this little jewel in you, and it's going to go on after everything breaks down and rots away, and it's what gets into the next life. And the Buddha says, no, actually you're made of these 5 khandhas or skandhas, which is, let's see if I can remember them now. It's been a while.
I'll get you back.
Okay, good. These body, feeling, perception, disposition or volition, and consciousness.
Actually, and someone I interviewed recently or last year described sankhara as drives.
Yeah, that's good.
Which actually I think gets
too.
to it too. It's like it gets to your evolutionary thing of like certain drives that propel us in a particular way.
Exactly. But of course, prior to the Buddha, the idea was that consciousness would be some special member of the 5, and it would be permanent, and it's basically a little piece of God. So it's eternal, and it's going to go on and on and on. And Buddha was like, no, consciousness is like a flame that burns on a wood fire. You eat up all the wood, and the flame is gone. So early notions of emptiness, you're right, are sort of just about saying, there's something there. There's flesh, there's consciousness, there's mind, of course, but there's no permanent, eternal substrata to all this change.
Well, yeah, if you combine those two, it's emptiness of permanency.
Right, emptiness of permanency, exactly.
Right.
But then later, the emptiness does take on, in different forms of Mahayana, it becomes, like you said, a metaphysical reality that the purest form of mindfulness actually communes with or connects with somehow.
Right. We got into Buddha Dharma a little bit more densely than I thought.
That's okay.
I know I meant to flag this as something I wanted to talk to you about, your own experience in Bhutan. Maybe we can cap the conversation on your book here and just say, great. I really enjoyed the book. I got a lot out of it. You saw, as I said to you earlier, I said you softened up this kind of hard-wing militant atheist. I'm much more sympathetic to my religious brethren now. So you saved one person.
Okay.
But you mentioned in the book a few times spending time in Bhutan, studying Vajrayana Buddhism, which, as a lowly Hinayanist myself, I don't have And for those listening, Hinayana is the referred to by the northern schools of Buddhism as like the lesser vehicle, the small boat. And the more perfect, evolved teachings are found in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. And so you've worked in that. And I'm just curious about what that experience was like. What kind of, because it seems like the Vajrayana, at least the way you're describing it, was also a blend of sort of magical, fantastic entities and teachings and notions.
Yeah.
And how did you, as a skeptic, how did you engage with that, and what have you taken from that in terms of your own day to day?
Yeah, I mean, it was a exciting experience to spend this time in Bhutan, and I feel fortunate that I was able to do it. I'm with you in a way. My own background was entirely in Theravada Buddhism, which is the only surviving school of Hinayana, and so all the Buddhism I studied was coming out of the Pali Tripitaka, which is considered the oldest scriptures that we have, and so this is what dominates in Sri Lanka, in Cambodia, where I lived. I taught at the Buddhist Institute in Cambodia, and my view was all this mystical mumbo jumbo is just got to go. It's all corruption of the Buddha's original teaching, which is just a kind of psychology, how to improve and control your mind, and put aside all the metaphysical stuff. Now, that was my view originally, and I'm in print making this argument. But I did notice that maybe this is part of my softening up, is that I had so much more fun and enjoyed all of this rich imagery that comes out of the Vajrayana tradition. Vajrayana Buddhism, which is, of course, is practiced in Tibet and in Bhutan. Bhutan sees itself as basically derivative, in a good way, from Tibetan Buddhism. They think that a Tibetan monk actually brought their Buddhism over the mountains to them. And this stuff, as I thought before, like a sort of a good Protestant, that you should get rid of the smells and bells and images of Catholicism, so you can focus on the real ideas. Now I'm very much an appreciator of the iconography, the Buddha. There's paintings everywhere in Bhutan of the Buddha with multiple arms and various embraces of sex, and there's like skulls everywhere. There's magical powers shooting out of people's eyes. Like it's crazy, and people can just sort of punch up Vajrayana Buddhism and see some of the great Thangka paintings that we're so familiar with. Absolutely gorgeous, obsessive representations of power. The Buddha is not just this guy sitting under a tree, like in the Theravada tradition. He's like a superhero with like rays shooting out of him, and you've multiplied all of his arms and his heads because that he's so badass that he's got all these powers. And
Marvel Comics Asia is actually doing a Vajrayana Buddha movie.
They need to. They really need to. But I've come to love this stuff because it is part of my overall argument is that the emotional brain evolved for millions of years. It's our mammal. It's part of our mammal phylogeny. And the neocortex rational brain is only recently just on the scene, like maybe during the Pleistocene era. But the emotional brain, which we share with mammals, has been built for really hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, you could basically go back. It might be even, many people will say mammals emerged after the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, but some of the earliest mammals go back 200 million years ago. So the emotional system then is very old and ancient, and it's one of our great motivating powers. Imaginative Buddhism, like you see in Bhutan, or like you see in Hinduism, for example, is very good at basically getting to that emotional brain. It activates your emotions. It gives you a sense of wonder. It gives you a sense of awe. It gives you a sense of, in some cases, everything's going to be all right. These are the therapeutic aspects of the imaginative work. And, there's an interesting, I think it's in the Diamond Sutra. Maybe I'm getting my sutras wrong here, but there's a Vajrayana Sutra that's famous and that Robert Thurman talks about, where you imagine a tree, and this is your wish granting tree, and you go into your mind's eye, you're meditating, and you go to the first branch, and what you've done is you put one of your heroes on the tree branch. This is one of your, maybe it's Gandhi. Maybe on this other branch you put Martin Luther King. Maybe on this branch, it's the Buddha, whatever. Maybe on this branch it's Charles Darwin. And when you need help, your meditation goes through this imaginative process where you go to the tree, you go to the guy in the branch, and you talk to them. And of course, in the indicative mind, this is you're just imagining stuff. You're talking to yourself. How dumb can this be? But if you think about that there's a kind of imperative form of knowledge, then you might actually be getting some wisdom and knowledge. Not literally. There's no guy in a tree talking to you, but your own mind is, in a sense, processing things differently now during this kind of meditation. So I've come to really like the sort of smells and bells form of Buddhism, that everything, if you look at Buddhism that's been cleaned of all this, it would be like Zen. Zen just doesn't care about the Buddha, doesn't care about images, just like meditate all day, get mindfulness, that's the only thing that matters. But around the rest of the Buddhist world, these images really matter, the stories really matter, and what you do is you go down to the temple, and they're not meditating, many of them don't meditate, lay Buddhists don't meditate in Asia. They light incense, they bring lotus flowers, they say prayers, they ask for help. My kid is sick. Buddha or Bodhisattva, Guanyin, please come and help. And that stuff is what provides them with the ability to get through life on a day-to-day basis. They're not developing the higher levels of jhana meditation. They're just going down to the temple. And so I really saw a lot of that in Bhutan, and I have to say I appreciated it.
You appreciated it. It sounds a little bit like you appreciated it as a foreigner or traveler would go and appreciate a different culture. But
no, I appreciate it philosophically.
But
yeah.
Have you brought back? What have you brought back with you into your own practice or day-to-day experience? That's a good question. One of the things that I like, that I learned in writing this book, is that there are these forms that I've always known about. You're raised Catholic, you know about praying the rosary. If you live in a Buddhist country, you know a lot about praying on the prayer beads. Mm-hmm. And in Bhutan, you're constantly spinning prayer wheels. Like everywhere you go, there are these beautiful, some of them are quite small. You've seen many of these. And you spin it, and they've written the Dharma or some sutra inside. And every time it spins around, it sends the sutra or the prayer into the sky to the Buddha so that he can hear it and respond. And all those prayer flags that you see, which are put out usually where in the in burial areas or high up in the Himalayas. I hiked way high in the Himalayas and hung one of these flags. And the idea is that the wind blows through it, and the sutra is written on the flag, and it carries the sutra up. And this is a way in which you can be constantly in communication with the higher powers. Now, of course, I don't think this is literally true. I'm a skeptic in this sense. But wow, it felt really good to do this. And I think that the rituals are actually the therapeutic aspects. So sometimes one of the things that my Bhutanese friend would say is he was fond of saying this, the English translation of it would be like, when he saw somebody suffering, he would say, may the Buddha reduce the suffering of all human beings, but especially this person now. And this was just a sort of a mantra that he would say. And it was kind of funny. He said, you can't, let's say your kid is sick. You can't say like, oh, Buddha, help my kid, period. The phrasing has to be, Buddha, please help the suffering of all sentient beings. And then you can go to your specific, loved ones. You got to do it in this order. And so I find myself saying this now. Like I was driving down the street, some guy was in an accident, and I said, Buddha, help the suffering of all sentient beings, and especially that guy. And it's not like I thought the Buddha's rearranging the universe for this guy, but it was a way for me to acknowledge that I felt this terrible vulnerability with this person. You see what I'm saying? Like I don't know how else to express it. Like I felt the suffering of this person. I couldn't go and help them. The ambulance is there, the paramedics are there, they're all helping the person. But nonetheless, there's
part of me as a human, and recognizing the suffering of another human being, that just sort of spontaneously wanted to acknowledge it in a way that was respectful and positive somehow. So that kind of stuff, I think I've brought back from my trip there.
Yeah, I mean, it's the alternative to not going through that little mini ritual when you see the guy in the accident and not. I mean, I don't say these phrases. Maybe I will after having spoken with you. But the alternative to, if you don't say that kind of thing, you're like, what happens to your mind doesn't go in, like, it doesn't occupy that relationship to the aggrieved, right?
I at least I didn't. Yeah, I don't, and I wouldn't, and I'd be like, oh, that sucks. That's terrible. Moving on. Whereas this simple formulaic saying, like you said, helps me to enter into the experience in a way that seems more meaningful. I'm not really helping this guy, but it's one of the reasons why people do these kind of gratitude meditations where you're once or twice a day, you should try to remember what was the good thing that happened to you today. Because it really is about what psychologists would call sort of reframing or appraisal theory. And if you can remind yourself of the positive emotions or reframe the negative emotions, it turns out to be very good for you, which is why I think ultimately religious people live longer. They're generally speaking healthier. They engage in less crime. They do very well on these metrics. They report more happiness. So I think all this stuff adds up.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word ritual and the kind of the dynamics of the ritual. I don't know if do you know this historian at Harvard? I think his name is Michael Puett, who's written a book on Chinese philosophers.
I know his name, but I have not read it.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote kind of a layman's book on the great Chinese philosophers, and at one stage he's talking about the power of ritual, where often we think of ritual as sort of some kind of supplicatory enactment where you're doing something to bring about some external event or to get something or to achieve some end. But he says the real power and transformation of the ritual is that the person doing it kind of steps outside of their normal mode and occupies a different possibility where they're out of their normal modus operandi, and in a way they're able to, I think what you would say is they're able to creatively or imaginatively, if only momentarily, literally be a different person within the scope of that ritual, and then and that kind of has this catalyzing effect on how they are once they come out. It may not be permanent, but it kind of it produces a kind of gradual transformation through the reenactment of that ritual.
That's exactly. I agree with that completely, and I think that this comes out of Confucian culture, because this is what Confucius was about. I mean, the contrast in Chinese philosophy is sort of Taoism, which is kind of like try to be as natural and flow as much as possible. But Confucius was all about trying to get these little rituals correct. And you're right. I think our tendency in the West is to read these as somehow they're punitive. They're just disciplining us. Hey, you're not the boss of me, But I think here's a thing that happened to me. I was on a plane the other day, and I'm on this plane, and the guy next to me. They give you these little blankets. It was very long. It was a trip to Asia, so they give you these little blankets sometimes to cover up with, So I used mine. He used his, whatever. But then I looked over and I noticed he had carefully folded this blanket like a friggin' origami package. It was the most beautiful thing. And he sets it over by his shoes. And I just look at him, and my first thought was why bother doing that? They're just going to. I look at mine, and it's bundled up. It's just crammed in by my shoes. The flight attendant's just going to take it. Somebody's going to wash it. No big deal. But then this happened to me a few months ago. Then I started doing this, and I thought, it's really stupid, really, how you fold your blanket or whatever. It really couldn't be less meaningless, but. I began to see this shows a certain respect that he has for the flight attendant who's going to have to take this. It shows a certain respect for his space that he has here. It shows a certain respect for himself that he's gone and done this and arranged it in a way. So there's a way of looking at these things that we would consider maybe courtesies or rituals even as being empty and too formal, but I think they do add up. Like they put you in a different mental space, and slowly you begin to maybe have more respect for the environment around you. Maybe you have more respect for the things that you're working with and dealing with. And I think this is one of the things that religion does: is it provides you. Look at Islam, for example. People think that religion is about the beliefs. I don't think so. 5 times a day, you have to stop what you're doing and face a certain way and maybe kneel, but basically like put your mind in a totally different space than it was when whatever you were doing. And I think that to focus on the metaphysics of Islam is to miss the therapeutic results of those practices and activities. My friend is from Turkey. He's telling me that his father will sort of read from. It's not reading. He has memorized passages of the Quran in Arabic, and he will recite them. Now he'll do this like once a day, and my friend says he's a totally different guy after he does it. Much more calm, relaxed. He's like the pillar of the family. You can count on him. He's not irritated or irritable. The guy doesn't even understand what he's reciting because he's memorized it in Arabic and he doesn't know Arabic. My point is that it's the activity, and that is basically a kind of physical calming. Just like when somebody's upset, the thing you want to do is maybe hold their hand. Like it has an effect on the body, on the limbic system and the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So in this way, I think even these small religious rituals can be very good for you.
Maybe, I know we're coming towards the time that we have together, but maybe just a closing question for you is like, where do you see things evolving? Because there does seem to be this kind of showdown between the nons and maybe the more strident, I hate to use the word militant because I think that's too denigrating, but the strident atheists and sort of the more religiously conventional groups. Where do you see the place of religion evolving? Say you could limit it. That's a big question, I realize, but like within the United States, even if you wanted to.
Yeah, that makes it easier because you're right. Depending on where you're at, that trajectory is going to be different. I think in the United States, there'll be tension between the generations as it keeps evolving. But some of this will also just age out. Like there'll be increasing. I think tolerance of diversity in religious views. It would be great if religion was seen more like musical taste than like metaphysics. And this has kind of happened in Northern Europe. If you think about Scandinavian countries, that might happen eventually here. But we have a pretty tough old-timey religion tradition here too, and things like creationism and down in the Bible Belt, it's really kind of the most literal interpretation of the scripture and most literal kinds of metaphysics. So I don't know how it's going to go. You do have a sort of red state, blue state tension in terms of religion. You do have an urban versus rural tension in religion. You have a generational age tension in religion. And I wouldn't hazard a guess as to how it's going to shake out. But I do think there might be ways of rapprochement. I mean,
this is this is maybe a better question to end on. I felt like that one's a little soft. Like in writing the book, like you're not going to be converting any of the secularists to say, oh, I need to go back to my Catholicism per se. But do you have the sense that it's more like just trying to soften that argument against religion, so that in the sense that like just let people be a bit?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Although I would qualify your first claim, which is I do think there are a lot of people who who maybe don't believe in the metaphysics of the religion like they were raised on or another religion, but they like the ritual, the liturgy, the social world of that religion. Mm-hmm. And I do hope my book invites them to return to religion and not think like, oh, just because I don't believe in this stuff, it's worthless. I'm trying to say there's value in it even when you don't believe in it, because belief is beside the point. That's just the top layer of this cake. So in that sense, I do think people will go, and I do invite them to go back to religion. And yes, but you're right. Ultimately, I would like there to be greater tolerance for religious people because, frankly, they make up the majority of all mainstream sort of cultures. And what they're trying to do is just get through life using religion. And I think it doesn't serve us well as intellectuals to just denigrate that and poo-poo it and not understand it.
Yeah, it's greater tolerance. Listen, it's been great talking to you again. Thank you so much, Stephen.
I really enjoyed it, Joss. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Hopefully we don't get too much blowback from the...
Oh, I'm sure people are going to be like, this guy is such an idiot. Yeah. I know what people are going to say. They think I'm defending... I should say this as a part of our conversation. Yeah. A lot of people won't hear my argument at all. They're going to be like, oh, he thinks you can believe in whatever you want. That's just we're slouching towards chaos. That's not my view. I don't think you can believe whatever you want. But there are certain ideas where the evidence is not clear. And if it's therapeutically good for you, then I say more power to you. Live and let live.
Amen. All right. Thank you, Stephen.
Take care.